Welcome to the Alex Salmond Show, where we continue our series on the politics of protest. In previous programmes, we've looked at the evolution of protest in the UK over the last century, from working class Glasgow taking to the streets in 1919, to the Rock Against Racism movement taking to the stage in the 1970s, to middle class London defending their green spaces against environmental destruction of HS2. In this show, we continue our theme against the background of a hot summer of mass demonstrations in London on the climate emergency, in Moscow over local elections, in Paris with the Gilets jaunes, and now the wave of protest in Hong Kong. We asked Peter Tatchell, the most famous human rights campaigner in the UK of the last generation, to reflect on his most effective campaigns and whether single issue and single-minded protest can still move the needle of political debate.
For me, protest is the lifeblood of democracy. All the rights and freedoms we have are the result of protest. That's how it began. Protest and then eventually parliamentary change.
We asked Medea Benjamin, the celebrated American political activist, what exactly is going on today? Are we seeing an international wave of discontent with established political structures akin to the 1960s? Or is this impression just a feature of the modern social media world, where a banner held aloft in Hong Kong goes viral before you can say presidential tweet?
I think social media can be a key to mobilizing like we see in Hong Kong, but I also think that before social media, we had enormous protests. We had mass protests around civil rights issues in the United States when there was no Facebook, no Twitter, no Instagram.
But first, let us take a look at your reaction to our series on Malta. Programmes which collectively registered over 800,000 viewers on Alex's Facebook page alone. That is more than the entire population of Europe's smallest member state. Clearly, the tiger economy of this tiny island is attracting a great deal of interest internationally. First, we hear from Jill, who says, "Found our French holiday apartment, unpacked, turned on the TV happy to find the Alex Salmond Show. But it felt sad for us that little Malta has what we could have had. Very interesting. Kept hearing our voices heard. Good on them and hope we join them soon." Fiona says, "Great show, one to watch. Explores the good and the not so good about Malta, but at least they're independent to decide that for themselves." Kath says, "Malta has no natural resources and yet they class people as their most valuable resource. Great wee series." Kotzur Brewster says, "Alex, I love your Malta series. No pretentiousness, no dazzling pomp nor high horse narrative. Your document is a lovely string of honest and mutually respectful encounters." Thank you so much. Linda says, "Christopher and I went there in 1965 with the Royal Leicester Regiment. Loved it. Have been back many times." Finally, Rory says, "I wonder if the show touched on the issues surrounding Malta's bunker trading. It has already cost one journalist her life. Just to clarify, Malta's a beautiful country and a great place to visit." Well, Rory, you can watch all of the series and see just how much of these topics we covered. Series, of course, being available on RT.com, on Alex's Facebook and on YouTube. Now to the politics of protest in modern Scotland. The last 4 years has seen a growing wave of demonstrations in favour of Scottish independence. From modest beginnings after the referendum campaign of 2014, these marches have been gaining ground and momentum. Largely ignored at first by the mainstream media and regarded with some suspicion by at least some in the SNP hierarchy, the grassroots campaigners have been turning in growing and impressive crowds as they march across the country. We asked some of the campaigners for Scottish independence whether their completely peaceful marches around Scotland are really making a political difference. Alex turns first to the organisers of the latest march in Aberdeen just last Saturday, and then to some of the people who were instrumental in organising the early marches, and also to the organisation who have live-streamed every event, forcing their presence onto the political agenda.
I'm now joined from the Granite City in Aberdeen by Teresa Duffy, one of the organisers of the Aberdeen March last weekend. Now, these marches have been taking place right round Scotland. They've been gathering strength, gathering numbers, gathering momentum. But do marches like that really make a difference? I mean, even the biggest march of 100,000 people in Edinburgh, somebody might say, well, that's 5 million plus people in Scotland not turning up at the march. Do these marches make a difference?
They absolutely do. They show our cause to be a normal, self-governing country in a very positive light. We meet up, we exchange information, ideas. The behaviour's impeccable, and the amount of people that you see, oh, this is my first march, or I'd love to go, but maybe marching's not my thing, but these people, they partake in street stalls, deliver leaflets, etc. So there's a wider range of ways that these groups throughout Scotland are growing, mushrooming and connecting.
Now, in this summer of protest that we've seen across the world, there have been lots of arrests in Paris, in London, in Moscow, in Hong Kong. The Scottish marches seem to pass without incident or arrest or anything. Why is that, Teresa?
I think because our vision for Scotland is for a better place. Another Scotland's possible. We want to see better outcomes for all the people that live here. Doesn't matter if you've been in Scotland 5 minutes or 50 years, you're Scottish. So with that positive light behind it, and to be fair as well, Police Scotland have just been so supportive and excellent. Every single march you go on, they've just been sterling. So we march with hope in our hearts and a smile on our faces, and we're pretty convinced we're going to get there. The latest poll, as you'll know, is 53%, and I believe rising. So we know we're getting there as well.
Now, these marches attract counter-demonstrations of people who are for the union. Is there any tension between the two groups as the march proceeds?
Well, not really. All the marchers know that small band are not representative now of the minority who want to stay in the UK. Nah, we just smile and whistle and carry on by.
And what would be your outstanding memory from Aberdeen's march last Saturday?
Just arriving in the Castle Gate and looking back down Union Street and seeing that sea of blue stretch all the way back.
And so these would be the wave of blue saltires, the national flag of Scotland, Teresa?
Absolutely. And actually the saltire is the oldest national flag in the world. I mean, the saltire has now come to signify to us not just Scotland, it signifies hope, it signifies a better country for us to live in, it signifies an end to nuclear weapons and a fairer, greener country, which is our aspiration, and I think the aspirations of the whole movement.
Well, Teresa, with that little bit of history, thank you very much for joining us from the granite city of Aberdeen.
It's a pleasure, Alex. Thank you.
Well, that's the most recent Independence March in Scotland's northern city of Aberdeen. But to talk about the early days of these marches, I caught up in Edinburgh with Manny Singh and Wendy MacDonald, who are speaking in a personal capacity. On this lovely sunny day in Edinburgh, I'm delighted to be joined by Manny Singh and by Wendy MacDonald. Now, can I ask you first, when you started this campaign of demonstrations, I mean, how many folk turned up to your first march?
Well, our first march, about 100 people showed up, and it was, it was quite disheartening, but when people started mocking us and laughing at us that we wouldn't make any impact, the marches were a waste of time, nobody cared, there was right after 2014 defeat. We had over 100,000 people, and the queue was queued all the way down here. So
this is where you had your big Edinburgh march last year. So you're all the way from here to where?
Yeah, from Johnston's Test all the way down to the Haymarket, so that's where the queue was.
Folk trying to go to the station.
And that's the day the Royal Mile got renamed the Independence Mile, so it's a fantastic day.
So Wendy MacDonald, what's your impression of your memories of these early marches?
My early memories was like it was 100 people, and you could shout back to someone at the back and you could answer them back. It was so small compared to today. Over 100,000 in Edinburgh, as we were saying there about Edinburgh, fantastic.
So you could stand at the back of your march saying, "Hi Jimmy, I can't see at the front."
Aye, have you got a drink of ginger there and pass something up? It was that easy. Now trying to spot somebody in a march is virtually impossible.
The marches itself, they make people think, the mainstream media paint us as a minority, but it shows that we're not a minority, we're a big force, and it shows that we're one people fighting for one cause.
So Wendy, when you got here last year and you suddenly realised, my goodness, there's going to be 100,000 folk here, what was your thoughts then?
Well, I live streamed the march at the front, and when I was coming down the Royal Mile, I could see all the flags, and I didn't have the full impact of how many's there because I'm at the front. But it's really heartwarming seeing everybody coming together as one, marching for the one cause.
But you're not just going for the big numbers, are you, Wendy, just now? Because you're taking your marches all around the country. You're taking the marches to the people instead of the people to the marches.
What we're finding, where a lot of people were contacting us asking, could we come to Perth, could we come to Campbelltown? So we looked into it, and we would like to just spread ourselves all around the country, because without us, it would look as if we went back in the box. We've managed to have one of the biggest marches Scotland's ever seen in its history, and that was Edinburgh itself, so we're doing tremendously good.
So you've had this momentum gathering behind the marches, but is that in itself enough? I mean, obviously your objective is not just to keep having ever bigger and bigger marches. You're trying to have a wider political impact. What evidence can you point to, Manny Singh, that you're having that percussion effect on the population?
We're getting people talking about independence again. As Wendy touched on earlier on, as we went to Dumfries, there was 10,000 people. Now that's a hard Tory area. 10,000 in Dumfries is a big number, and one of the biggest things we've seen was businesses coming out and smiling, because we're a welcoming march. It's not hatred compared to other marches that take place in Scotland that are stuck in the Stone Age, but it's welcoming, and people want to be part of that. Something new, a new Scotland, a new Scotland that everyone's welcome.
Well, now by the miracle of television, I now have a couple of Alex Salmond quakes. So to you, Wendy.
That's brilliant, thank you very much. Thanking you.
Manny.
Thank you very much.
Now, having spoken to some of the independence campaigners, I now turn to the organisation which has live streamed every single one of these marches. Kevin Gibney from Independence Live, welcome to the Alex Salmond Show.
Hi Alex, pleasure to be on.
You must have seen these marches growing in number. I mean, when you started covering them, were it like two people in a dug, or what was happening?
Yeah, I remember the first march. I don't think we actually live streamed that. That was it was just raining. There was maybe about 200-300 people in Glasgow. I remember a fellow going along in his wheelchair and the rain pouring down, and it was a typical, Glasgow summer day.
So was that your aim? Because initially, at least, the marches were being ignored or mocked by the mainstream media. Was Independence Live a response to that, to get the message across?
It's interesting. Live streaming is a great way to bypass the mainstream media. Anybody can do it with a mobile phone in their hand. If anybody's interested, get in contact with us, we'll show you how to do it for your group,
So given the success in these live broadcasts by mobile phone or by other means from across the country, are you going to move into other media outlets now?
Well, we've got a new platform for getting information out about Scottish independence, etc. And that is, we've started indielive.radio. So that's been going since this year. It's still soft launch. We're still trying to get more people to do content for us, but it's quite exciting. And we can run our radio through live streams and stuff. So it's quite an interesting mesh of technologies, and it's all good. Loving it.
Kevin, thank you for appearing on this mainstream media, the Alex Salmond Show.
Not a problem. Not a problem. You're all good.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you.
Join us after the break when Alex interviews two of the most celebrated political activists of recent years from both sides of the Atlantic. Welcome back. To discuss the effectiveness of political protest, Alex turns first to veteran campaigner for human rights, Peter Tatchell, the master of the one-person protest from Red Square in Moscow to the pulpit of Canterbury Cathedral. Peter Tatchell first came to public prominence as the unsuccessful Labour Party candidate in the Bermondsey by-election, one of the most bruising contests of the 20th century. For the last 40 years, he has continued to hit the headlines as one of the most courageous campaigners for human rights in general and LGBT rights in particular.
In this series, we've looked at the politics of protest throughout the last century, and in recent years, some of the great campaigns from Rock Against Racism in the 1970s onwards. I now interview somebody who's been involved in many of these campaigns, but also has specialised as a courageous, single-person human rights campaigner. Delighted to be joined by Peter Tatchell. Peter, welcome back to the Alex Salmond Show.
Glad to join you again.
Now, Peter, you, as a human rights activist, over the last 40 years or so, you've been involved in many of the great protests, but you've also had a bit of a specialty in either single-person campaigns or you and a group of people making a point. Is that because that you believe there are subjects that require that sort of attention. Tell us some of the highlights of these sort of campaigns.
Well, a lot of these single or small person protests were very secretive, had to be kept very secretive because they involved an element of surprise, such as ambushing President Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe in London in 1999, such as going into the pulpit of the Archbishop of Canterbury, Dr. George Carey, the year before in 1998.
Well, let's take these two in turn. I mean, this is when Robert Mugabe was still persona grata with the UK Foreign Office and everybody else, still in the pomp of his power. But you ambushed him at his hotel in London, a bit to your personal cost, if I remember correctly. What exactly happened there?
Well, together with 3 other members of the LGBT group Outrage, we sought to make a citizen's arrest of President Mugabe on charges of torture. This wasn't an LGBT plus issue, it was about torture. And so when he drove out of his hotel, St James's Court Hotel near Victoria, we ran in front of his limousine, forcing it to halt. I opened the rear car door, amazingly it was unlocked, and put him under arrest under charges of torture under British and international law.
President Robert Mugabe, I hereby arrest you as a citizen under international law because of your abuse of human rights in Zimbabwe.
Exactly.
And
you should have seen the look on his face.
But did he say anything?
I mean, he is very dark-skinned, but a visible ashen pallor came across his face. His jaw dropped, his eyes popped. He held up his hands in front of him like a frightened 10-year-old kid. I think he probably thought he was going to be killed, to which I thought in my own mind, now you know what your victims feel like, only we aren't going to kill you, we're going to take you to a court of law, where you'll have a chance to defend yourself.
So what happened then? Did his henchmen pounce upon you? I mean, did you get dragged away, or did you manage to get the handcuffs on the president?
Well, we of course summoned the police, which is the requirement under the power of citizen's arrest. The police were not interested in the legal dossier we had for his arrest. Instead, we were arrested, and President Mugabe was given a police escort to go Christmas shopping at Harrods. Now,
one of your other démarches, as you mentioned, was you occupied the pulpit of the Archbishop of Canterbury just as he was about to deliver his Easter homily in church. How did that go?
Well, we had tried to have a dialogue with the Archbishop, George Carey, for 8 years. He refused to meet us or anybody from the LGBT plus community. So that's why, in desperation, as a last resort, we went into his cathedral. And all we did was walk up into the pulpit, and we held up placards highlighting the anti-gay laws that he was supporting, like the right of, he said, employers should, in certain circumstances, have the right to sack someone from that because they were gay. There should be no legal recognition of same-sex relationships, that same-sex couples are unfit to foster or adopt children, etc. And then I simply delivered an alternative sermon, which was along the lines of, discrimination is not a Christian value.
For which you were described, if I remember right, in the LGBT community as St. Peter, were you not?
I think some did, yes. But the upshot was that I was arrested and eventually charged under the Ecclesiastical Courts Jurisdiction Act of 1860, formerly part of the Brawling Act of 1551. And under that law, it's illegal to interrupt a minister of religion in a place of worship. The Archbishop was so embarrassed when it got out that we only did this after he refused to meet us for 8 years, that he did eventually meet with the lesbian and gay Christian movement. He did dramatically reduce his lobbying of members of Parliament to oppose gay equality, and he did prompt other bishops in the church to speak out in favour of LGBT rights. So it had a very positive impact.
So 20 years on, with LGBT rights, certainly in terms of marriage, recognised in the UK, with the exception thus far of Northern Ireland. Again, looking back, people would say, well, maybe that protest had a more than a bit going for it, because what seemed a protest worthy of prosecution at the time now is the accepted law of most of this land.
Well, that's right. When I look back, you know, when I began in 1967 at the age of 15, there were so many things that seemed insurmountable odds, like apartheid was in full swing and people thought it would never change, but it did, thanks to the contribution of millions of people in South Africa and worldwide. You think about Margaret Thatcher's poll tax, you know, she said it was not negotiable, there was going to be no rowing back on the poll tax, but eventually because of the mass protests, she did recant and the poll tax is now history. So for me, protest is the lifeblood of democracy. All the rights and freedoms we have are the result of protest. That's how it began. Protest and then eventually parliamentary change.
Now, of course, through your campaigning career over these decades, you've been largely associated with LGBT equality and campaigns. But that's not been your only campaigns. Indeed, your early campaigns as a boy in Australia, I think one of them was for Aboriginal land rights.
That's right, and against the death penalty, against Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War, against apartheid. Yeah, I'm a multiversed campaigner, and for me, I believe in the principle of universal human rights for everyone, regardless of who they are.
But nowadays, I mean, a actual protest, I mean, to think about the protest in the World Cup in Moscow, I think, I mean, that was immediate news within seconds around the globe. So the modern technology must have made the protests easier, facilitated protests.
Yeah, much easier to organise, much easier to mobilise large numbers of people because social media provides such a ready, instant access.
Peter Tatchell, as we say in Scotland, lang may your lum reek, and long may you continue your protests. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
To put this summer of political protest into context, Alex turned to Medea Benjamin, the American political activist, co-founder of Code Pink and the fair trade advocacy group Global Exchange.
Medea Benjamin, co-founder of Code Pink, welcome to the Alex Salmond Show.
Nice to be on with you, Alex.
Now, Medea, this summer we've seen the Extinction Rebellion in London. We've seen the protests in Moscow about elections, the Gilets jaunes in France, the spectacular protests in Hong Kong in recent weeks. Are we living through an age of protest? Are we back in 1968? Or is it just the social media amplifying everything that's happening across the world?
I think the protests around the climate are new and are global and are huge and are only going to grow as this is a planetary issue that affects us all. But then in some other areas, I think we're seeing less. For example, we saw in the Middle East all of the uprisings around the Arab Spring, and that spread from one country to another. But now that it looks like the results of those were not so positive, I think that's put a damper on some other protests in the Middle East, for example. So I think we're constantly seeing ups and downs in protests, but around the climate, this is enormous and will only grow.
Medea Benjamin, you're one of America's most celebrated activists across a range of causes in human rights. How has your own campaigning been affected by the social media age? Do you do things differently now as a result of social media?
Actually, the issues that I am most involved in, which is trying to stop wars, have been harder to organize, not particularly because of the social media age, but just because the wars have become so fuzzy. They've gone on for the last 20 years. It's harder to get people out on the streets. So that's an example about how the issues are still extremely important, but social media isn't enough to galvanize people if it's not something that is really hitting them home, really affecting them immediately. So I think social media can be a key to mobilizing like we see in Hong Kong. But I also think that before social media, we had enormous protests. We had mass protests around civil rights issues in the United States when there was no Facebook, no Twitter, no Instagram.
Looking at that age of campaigning, as the most famous, perhaps, campaigner of the recent generation, do you think American society has made progress across that range of issues? Or in a Trumpian age, is this a sign of reversion in the United States?
Well, certainly we've made progress over the years, and we are making progress on forcing our government to deal with some issues like getting us out of the wars we've been in for 20 years, or issues around the police brutality, racism issues. But they have, in the age of Trump, there are so many issues. We have the crisis of immigration on our borders. We have the issues of increasing white supremacy. We have the issues of our protests But then we have the other side protesting as well, the people who want to take away women's rights to abortion, the people that want to show their ability to use hate speech openly in our streets. So there are protests on both sides, but I do think that we are constantly making progress. It's just that new issues keep hitting us. During the age of Trump, we feel like we have whiplash because we're always going from one crisis to another.
Now, recently you visited my home country of Scotland to campaign against the Trident nuclear system. How did you find protesting in Scotland?
Well, I think it's a time where there's not as strong a protest against nuclear issues, but there certainly was a lot of excitement about independence in Scotland and how independence would mean the end to having nuclear submarines based in Scotland. So I found a lot of excitement around that.
And what message would you have for the more comfortable establishments in your country and in others about the intention of Medea Benjamin to continue her campaigning?
I think that the issues that we're facing, whether it's war, climate destruction, continued racism, fights for democracy around the world, they're not going to go away. Those are issues that we, myself included, care deeply about. These are lifelong struggles, and people should get involved and get active, because the more of us that get active, the sooner that we're going to see results on these issues, and the better our world will be for it.
Medea Benjamin, thank you so much, and keep on campaigning.
Thank you. Nice to be on your show.
In our series on political protest, we've roamed far and wide in looking at the history of activism, stretching from working-class Glasgow of 100 years ago to middle-class London of the present day. In the modern world, the impact of protest has been amplified by an extraordinary amount in the age of social media. This allows demonstrations to not just be substantially better attended, but also to have much wider coverage without a reliance on the established media, who often look askance at demonstrations, especially those in their own countries. However, the successful demonstration requires more than just imaginative and impactful social media coverage. It requires a cause that people are prepared to believe in, often at substantial personal cost. That much, at least, has not changed in the last century. Join us next week when we turn from the international politics of protest to the parliamentary politics of a no-deal Brexit in the UK. With Parliament back from recess in 2 weeks' time, will the MPs change from lounging on the beaches to fighting on the benches? We'll be joined by two key commentators who predict the fireworks to come. Until then, from Alex and I and all at the show, it's goodbye for now, and we hope to see you